Hello, and welcome to Grade.com Talks With. Today we're talking with Ben Wilterding, Director of Programs at Archbridge Institute, an organization that is working to lift barriers to economic mobility by producing and disseminating multidisciplinary academic and policy research to empower individuals to thrive and strengthen civil society. And if you're new to our podcast, please press subscribe button either on YouTube or your podcast app, because today we're going to learn about an organization that is helping to secure the American dream for a new generation of youngsters. Hello, Ben. Welcome to Grade.com Talks With. We're excited to have you here.
Thanks, Kareem. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. How would you describe Archbridge Institute to someone who is not familiar with your work?
Sure. I think I'd start by describing how we think about the American dream. And what that really means is, how can we make sure that our kids are better off than we are? How can we make sure that through the generations we're growing wealth and people are moving up the income ladder? And what we really try to work on is identifying some of the barriers that are holding people back and ideally removing those barriers. And so that's sort of the 5,000-foot overview, which you sort of covered a bit. But the way that we try to do that is through academic research primarily, but also spotlighting some of the organizations and some of the people like entrepreneurs who are really on the ground making a difference. And so I'll be the first to admit, we're not out there doing direct services, but we try to highlight some of the people and the organizations that are, in addition to promoting the academic research that talks about how best to engage with this problem. And as you know, it's not always quite so easy as some people might think.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So I see you as a tool to bring awareness to the issue and bring solutions through highlighting the story, through highlighting the work that other people are doing, so everyone can come together and build civil society without barriers to economic mobility.
Yeah, that's right. That's what we hope for anyway.
What is economic mobility, and how is it affecting the lives of Americans?
Sure. So economic mobility, you can measure it a couple of different ways. The way that is probably most important that we focus on a lot is called absolute economic mobility. And what it does is it takes a measure of a person's income, whether it's maybe family income, that's probably the most common, at a given point in time, say age 35 or 40, it depends on the study. And then you measure their children's family income at that same point in their life, right? And then you kind of compare where they are on how much income they're making, of course, inflation adjusted, and see, are they making more than their parents earned at the same age, or are they making less than their parents earned at the same age? And so we call that either upward or downward economic mobility. And so that's just in absolute sense. There's also relative economic mobility, which it's a little bit trickier because what that does is it sort of divides the population into usually 5 different quintiles, and that's delineated by income bracket. And so what we're doing then is, instead of measuring the actual number of dollars that a person is earning at a given point in time, what you're looking at is where on the income distribution were their parents, and then when the children are at the same age, where are they on the income distribution relative to everyone else? So you can see how those two differ a little bit, but I think both are important for getting a more complete picture. Obviously, it's very possible for someone to not have any relative economic mobility, or even to have downward relative economic mobility, but still be earning more than their parents, which that's actually what a lot of the data shows. So if I know I'm filibustering here for a second, but if I can continue for just a minute, what we're seeing in the data right now anyway, there's been a lot of great studies by this Raj Shetty at Harvard and his colleagues Nathaniel Hendren and their whole team at Opportunity Insights have been doing some good work on this, and they've measured different slices of this. And they found some pretty negative headlines with the rate of economic mobility. And for a generation that was born in roughly the 1940s, it was about 90% were doing better. And then that's fallen. So the generation that they measured that's born roughly in the 1980s, this is all very back of the envelope, but that group had fallen to about 50%. Now, we did some of our own research with a different data set from Dr. Scott Winship, and he found that once you use a better adjustment for inflation and you count some of the taxes and transfer incomes, that equation, it does look a little better with about 75%, almost a little bit less than that, of people achieving upward economic mobility. But the real story is that for poorer children, almost all of them are earning more than their parents. So I think that's sort of the hidden gem in some of this data, is that, you know, we can sort of slice it a few different ways and kind of tell some of these different narratives. But at the end of the day, almost all of the poor children that were born in that time period are earning more than their parents were at that time.
Mm-hmm. So in short, economic mobility is the measure of the wealth of children compared to their parents when they were their age, correct?
I'd say income, but yes, generally, colloquially speaking, yes.
You mentioned that the research that was done by Harvard University and some other people that you have indicated that the children today compared to their parents when they were their age from the poor backgrounds are earning more. However, that's although they might be earning more, however, that money doesn't go as far as it used to be, correct? Or is it not?
Well, I would say that it's sort of a mixed bag. You know, inflation adjustment gets us so far, and I would say that everything I've been saying, of course, is inflation adjusted. So they aren't losing income in that way. We're not sort of missing it in the measurement because their purchasing power is roughly the same. But it's not always easy to compare some of the basket of goods that you can buy, right? So say someone in the 1970s, you know, there's a lot of this kind of stuff that we're glossing over. There's been a lot of different changes in the family structure and the makeup in terms of how much of the population is living as a married couple with children versus single people. That's changed a lot. There are certainly trends that our housing costs have risen, but in general, we have bigger houses than people did, you know, 40, 50 years ago. It's hard to measure, you know, how much utility someone gets from an average smartphone, you know, versus, you know, metrics like, you know, 50 years ago, we were talking about how many households had TVs in them, you know, and that just seems so antiquated. I would say that in general, we do our best to do inflation adjustment. And so it's that's not being lost in some of these metrics and what some of these findings are reporting. But it is a little tricky. It's a little more complicated because you have a lot of these other things that are difficult to quantify, or there's just so much information. So many things are moving around.
Mm-hmm. You're indeed right, mentioning there's so many factors, and one factor, it's not apple to apples, as the quality of life has risen, and there's so many innovations in the life of the new generation at the moment. I personally,
Right.
when I've lived in US a couple of years ago, and I was doing my internship, and I had friends who are working in big tech companies. However,
Mm-hmm.
they were earning six-figure incomes, yet their parents were telling them, "Oh, you're not doing enough. You haven't bought the home yet. You are not doing this. When I was at your age, I've already
Yeah.
achieved that." So it shows that although people are earning more, yet there's still limiting factors that are pushing, creating barriers for them to even grow faster or be on the same level or better than their parents used to be. And everyone
Yeah.
has this new definition of American dream. Can you please explain to us what was the definition of American dream for the generation of boomers, and what's the definition of American dream for generation of millennials and Gen Z upcoming?
You know, I think that would be an interesting question. I wish I could give you a little bit more of like an empirical measure on there. But what I can say is what we have done, we've done some surveys actually called the American Dream Snapshot. So we've done a couple of these now, and you can view them on our website, archbridge institute.org. But what we've generally found, according to our latest survey, is that most people consider, and this is contemporary, so right now this is measuring people across age groups in 2020. So what we found was most people consider the American dream to be freedom of choice in how to live. And so that was by far the top definition. Sometimes you get things like having a good family life was right after that, which is kind of interesting because both of those aren't necessarily material, which I thought was particularly striking. We did have a metric that people were able to choose from, becoming wealthy, and some people did that, but only about a third. It was actually much less than you might think. Some of the other things that get thrown in there are like having a comfortable retirement or owning a home. And to varying degrees, people consider those part of the American dream. But I think the key thing that we learned from that survey was the two things that really stood out as being the embodiment of the American dream were, first and foremost, freedom of choice in how to live, and secondly, having a good family life. And so that's really what the data is telling us. It's not necessarily bound up with income or wealth. It's a little less tangible than that. And I think that is a really interesting finding that should really inform some of our public policy as well.
Indeed, I'm quite surprised and shocked that it's those two answers, freedom of choice and great family life, are top two. Whenever, at least in the public, in the media, it's like it's being wealthy, it's being entrepreneur, it's always hustling and working. That's an American dream. However, your data, the work that you guys are doing has shown that it's more about non-materialistic things and being having a choice and having a great family life. That's a great indicator.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting too. And to be clear, some of that stuff is bound up with income. I mean, you need a certain level of income in order to achieve some of those things. But I think what it tells me is that people aren't as concerned with some of these, we see a lot of these headlines of wealth inequality and some of that kind of thing. And there's not a lot of data to support that that's the thing that people really care about. I think, when we come across public policies, often there is a kind of trade-off between, are we going to try to equalize things, or are we going to try to create greater opportunities and greater chances for economic growth? And those can sometimes work in hand, but oftentimes they kind of butt heads a bit. And I think, we're firmly on the side of, people getting the chance to have more opportunities, a chance to really do something that they love, is probably more important than getting them a little bit marginal extra dollar in the bank account.
Mm-hmm. So it's not one solution. It's a holistic approach to economic mobility. It's a holistic approach, seeing that there's not only one factor, there's multiple factors coming in, and we have to take them in account when coming up with solutions in changing public policy. You mentioned about the
so many factors.
Absolutely. You mentioned that you have done surveys. Can you tell us in detail what kind of public policy work that you do, and how is it actually impacting the legislation or the solutions that is needed for those problems that you're addressing?
Sure. Yeah. So I can tell you that we are probably one step removed from some of that rubber meets the road. We try to inform policymakers to the best of our ability and make sure that our research makes it into their hands so they can use it when they're evaluating choices. But that said, we don't lobby. We're not calling up lawmakers and telling them to vote yes or vote no on certain things. There are a lot of people out there who are doing that and are doing some pretty good stuff, but that's not really our focus. Our focus is a bit more informational. And so to your point about looking at some of these different factors, we do these surveys from time to time. We're probably going to continue doing those different snapshots just to kind of keep an eye on that data and see how things are changing across the years and with different circumstances. But we really try to take as holistic of a view of economic mobility as possible. And I think what that really entails is we try to look at sort of both the natural and the artificial barriers to economic mobility. So that's sort of a dichotomy that we think about sometimes, and there's a lot of overlap there. But if you can think about it this way, you know, a natural barrier is something that, you know, maybe a person is struggling with something that's very personal, but it's not necessarily being imposed on them from the outside. You know, maybe it's sort of like a mental health problem, or they're struggling with addiction, or, you know, a cycle of homelessness, or, you know, there's a lot of different things that it could be. That's not necessarily that's something that someone is, you know, pushing on them from the outside. It's more of an internal thing. And that's where we think these community organizations and these organizations that can really reach out to them in a personal level and make a personal connection and really get to know them and really understand what's happening here, because it's really not one size fits all in terms of addressing those types of hard problems. And so what we try to do is support, you know, shine a light on the local organizations that are doing that good work, and recognizing that bigger programs, while they have their place, aren't necessarily going to be effective in solving those problems. And then on the other side, we have the artificial barriers, which are barriers that are typically imposed by some external thing. Typically, what this means is government. And so what we focus on particularly in that area is, say, one of the ones that we've had the most success with researching and hopefully implementing in a public policy, as we see areas where we've done studies make positive changes in this area. But that's occupational licensing reform. You know, so back in the 1950s, you know, basically 1 in 20 occupations required a license to even be legal to do them. Today, that number is about 1 in 4. So we've seen this explosion of occupational licensing regulations across the states that are really holding back people from employment opportunities, and they're driving up the cost of services. And to no discernible benefit. I mean, this is one of the things that has been continuous. You know, it started maybe with the Obama administration recognizing it, and it carried through with a Trump administration executive order. This is one of a handful of issues I really do think is truly bipartisan. People are recognizing that these things are a problem. So that's one example. I mean, another example of an artificial barrier is zoning laws. You know, so like you mentioned, you know, you said you had some experience with friends working in the high tech sector, and as you know, a lot of that is very geographically clustered in some of these bigger cities, and we're seeing that pattern across a lot of different sectors of the economy, where you have some superstar regions that are doing really well, and then some areas, some parts of the country, regionally speaking, that are kind of falling behind a little bit, or not keeping up as much. And you know, when people want to move from a less productive area where there are fewer employment opportunities to a more productive one, there's a 10,000-foot wall called cost of living, and it's got everything to do with rents. And, you know, the housing stock is just not keeping up with this. It's driving these rent and home prices through the roof. And so when we look at that, the thing that's really holding back creating the housing that people need and pushing those prices down is, it's not a lack of materials or will or market demand. What really is happening is, you know, zoning laws and land use regulations are preventing that development from happening. And so that's another example of an artificial barrier that's sort of being imposed. And so we try to look at both sides of that coin and see what is the most effective thing that we can do here to sort of alleviate this issue. And in some cases, when it's artificial or externally imposed, you know, there maybe there is a policy that we can change. But sometimes, you know, if it's something that's like deeply personal, or if it's something that is, you know, within a person themselves. I mean, everyone has their own story, and that's something that, you know, we want to support them with a social safety net, but we also want to make sure that to really address that problem, it's something that people can't really do from afar very effectively, versus people that are on the ground working in those communities to address that one-on-one.
I really liked how you mentioned that there is natural barriers as well as there's artificial barriers. And the work that you are doing, you're highlighting those two different barrier types, and bringing awareness, bringing attention, and of the general public as well as the policymakers. That's worth acknowledgement, and I applaud you for that. How do you see
Thank
those?
you.
How do you see those barriers changing in the next 5 to 15 years to economic mobility?
That's an interesting question. I think, like anything, I think it's going to be a mixed bag. On the positive side, like I mentioned, some of the more egregious barriers, I think, on the artificial side are finally getting some acknowledgement. So I did mention the Obama administration put out a big study on occupational licensing regulations. There seems to be a lot of states. So, for instance, it started with Arizona, but now it's spread to other places like Iowa, most recently. Mississippi is now considering it. There are a lot of states that are considering what we call universal recognition bills. So what they're saying is, just because a person moves from one state to another, they didn't lose all of their skills or all of their knowledge and how to, be a hairdresser or, whatever the occupation might be. And so what they're doing is, rather than making them reapply for a new license and go through all of the hoops that might entail, education requirements, fees for different kinds of schooling, fees for paying for administrative costs, they're basically just saying, okay, well, if you had a license from the state that you came from and you've been practicing this in this area for a year or more, we're going to just recognize you as having this license in our state. And so that's a reform that's really caught on, and I expect that to really improve. On the zoning issue, I think this is another one that really cuts across a lot of this partisan stuff. You have some more libertarian-minded people and some more neoliberal people that are kind of coming together, and what we see is something called the YIMBY movement, right? It's called Yes in My Backyard. And that's kind of saying yes to development. Yes, we want more housing. We want more of this stuff. And I think that is also catching on in some of the bigger cities. So I think in those two areas, I'm very optimistic. I think we're going to see a lot of improvement. Unfortunately, I think in some of the other areas, we might struggle a little bit more. I think we're nationalized in the sense that a lot of things are more centrally focused. We're doing things a lot more from Washington, D.C., rather than letting states or local communities kind of take the driver's seat there. So you see proposals for a $15 minimum wage. That is, fortunately, that doesn't look like it's going to be made into federal law, but there's certainly a lot of pushes for that. And the thing to highlight is, maybe that would work in San Francisco or New York. It wouldn't be too much of a big deal, but what's going to work in that area is not going to work necessarily for very rural Mississippi or another economically depressed area with much lower median wages. And so regardless of whatever you think about the minimum wage, making sure that you don't set that policy at the federal level and at least have states have some say and some wiggle room there, I think is really important. So I think that we could take some hits in terms of mobility and some background things over the years, depending on how things go. I think the more that we can devolve, probably the better we're going to be, but that does not seem to be where the trend is going right now in a lot of these key areas. So I'm expecting a pretty mixed bag.
Yeah, based on your answer, it sure is going to be a mixed solution. So there is not a universal solution that is going to work to all states, as the U.S. is such a huge country, and the wealth and abilities of each state do vary. However, the first issue that you mentioned, if the person has an education, has work experience, has skills, and making it easy for them to move from one state to another without accruing too much cost, educational cost, as well as getting the licensing cost, that's a good direction that we're going. So,
Yes,
if someone would like to support Artbreach Institute, how can they do that?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would say is to check out our website, archbridgeinstitute.org. We have a lot of different commentary. You can see all of our research there. We usually put out new research pieces roughly once a month, and we'll have a lot of different commentary several times. I host a different podcast that delves really deep into some of the issues that we've been discussing, such as zoning and licensing and different, economic things about economic mobility. So I would say, sign up for our newsletter and maybe even consider making a donation.
Mm-hmm. Well, all the links to your website and as well as your social media present and as well as your podcast will be provided in the description of this podcast episode. It was very wonderful to get to know you, Ben, as well as learn about the work you are doing at the Artbreach Institute, and we hope the best for you and your organization.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kareem. I really appreciate you having me on today.
And if you liked our podcast, this conversation, please like it and share it, because this will show the YouTube algorithms as well as the podcast algorithms that the barriers that is on the way of the economic mobility is an important issue that we need more people talking about, and we need more attention of policymakers. See you on the next episode. Take care.